The convoy of lorries wound through Hampshire's narrow lanes under a sky the colour of wet slate. Rain drummed against canvas tarps stretched over the truck beds, where 30 German generals sat in silence, their field-grey uniforms darkened by moisture. General Friedrich Müller, age 54, pressed his palm against the cold metal railing and watched the English countryside roll past through gaps in the tarp. 3 days earlier, he had commanded a panzer division near Lüneburg. Now he was cargo, bound for internment on an enemy island he had been taught to despise. He had expected ruins. The Luftwaffe had pounded British cities for years, or so the Reich Ministry of Propaganda claimed. London was rubble. Liverpool had burned to ash. The people starved behind their barricades, clinging to survival by American charity alone. Democracy, they said, had collapsed into mob panic and desperation. Yet through the rain-streaked canvas, Müller glimpsed something else entirely. Hedgerows trimmed with geometric precision. Stone cottages exhaling chimney smoke. Fields ploughed in straight furrows despite 6 years of war. A farmer guiding a plough horse paused to watch the convoy pass, then returned to his work without drama. The land looked tired but unbroken. Telegraph poles stood in orderly ranks alongside the road. Train tracks ran uninterrupted, gleaming dully in the rain. The convoy slowed, gears grinding, and turned onto a gravel drive flanked by iron gates. Guard towers rose against the grey sky, manned by British soldiers in khaki battle dress who smoked cigarettes and nodded politely as the trucks rumbled through. Beyond the wire, a sprawling Georgian manor loomed, its red brick facade darkened by rain but intact, almost serene. Barbed wire coiled along the perimeter fence, but the estate's gardens remained visible. Skeletal rose bushes and dormant flower beds waiting for spring. Müller stared at the manor as the lorry shuddered to a halt. This was captivity. This was the punishment he had been promised. Yet standing before him was not a cage, but an institution, orderly and quiet, as if civility itself had become a weapon he did not yet know how to counter. The processing began without ceremony. British soldiers, their voices clipped but not harsh, directed the generals through the manor's entrance hall into what had once been a ballroom. Chandeliers still hung from the vaulted ceiling, though the floor now held rows of folding tables stacked with paperwork. An officer with greying temples and a major's insignia stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back, waiting as the prisoners filed in and formed uneven lines. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention," he announced in practiced German. "Quarters are heated, meals are provided 3 times daily, medical care is available upon request. Your personal effects have been catalogued and will be returned upon repatriation." Müller watched the major's face for signs of mockery. He found none. The tone carried the same brisk neutrality the man might use to brief his own staff. It was efficiency without cruelty, a system that did not require humiliation to function. Each prisoner was issued a wool blanket, a tin mug, and a mimeographed sheet outlining camp regulations. No shouting accompanied the distribution. No guards shoved them forward. Instead, corporals checked names against lists, handed over supplies, and gestured toward the dormitories with the same polite indifference one might show late arriving guests. Müller's assigned quarters occupied the manor's east wing, where servant rooms had been converted into sparse but functional dormitories. 12 cots lined the walls, each with a folded blanket and a pillow. A single electric bulb hung from the ceiling. The floor was swept clean. A radiator along the far wall hissed faintly, throwing weak heat into the room. That night, lying on his narrow cot, Müller listened to rain batter the roof tiles, while whispers circulated in the dark. "They are softening us for interrogation," muttered General Hartmann from the neighboring bed. "They want intelligence, not vengeance." "They starve their own people," another voice added, brittle with bitterness. "How can they afford to feed us?" Müller said nothing. He was thinking of the farmer with the plough horse, the hedgerows, the unbroken train tracks. If Britain was starving, it hid the evidence with disturbing competence. Morning arrived with the clang of a bell, and the scent of porridge drifting through the corridors. Breakfast was served in a converted dining hall, where long wooden tables replaced the estate's original furniture. The meal was plain: oatmeal thickened with powdered milk, bread with margarine, weak tea, but it was warm and it was plentiful. Müller ate slowly, noting that the British Guards received identical rations. No hierarchy of privilege divided captor from captive at the table. After breakfast, the generals were assembled in the manor's library for orientation. Bookshelves lined the walls, volumes in German, English and French available for borrowing. A chess set sat on a side table, pieces arranged mid-game as if someone had left in the middle of a match. The major stood before a blackboard and explained the daily schedule with the precision of a schoolmaster. Morning roll call, work details for those fit enough, afternoon lectures on agricultural techniques or mechanical repair, evening recreation supervised but not restricted. Müller raised his hand. His English was halting but clear. "Why treat us this way? We are your enemies." The major regarded him with something approaching patience. "You were our enemies," he corrected. "Now you are prisoners under our care. The distinction matters." The answer lodged in Müller's chest like a splinter. It suggested a logic he had not encountered in his own command, a framework where power did not require humiliation to prove itself. Around him, other generals shifted uncomfortably, their certainties beginning to fracture. By the third day, the paradoxes compounded. Letters from Germany arrived, censored but unaltered, delivering news of a homeland collapsing into occupation zones and famine. Meanwhile, the prisoners slept under wool blankets, walked the estate grounds during designated hours, and ate tinned beef twice a week. The barbed wire reminded them they were captives, but the treatment suggested they were something else, witnesses to a system that functioned without terror. Müller stood at the library window one evening, watching British soldiers change shifts at the guard tower. They moved with calm routine, no dramatic displays of authority, just men performing duty without spectacle. He thought of the major's words again. The distinction matters. Perhaps, he realized, that was the point. Britain did not need to crush its enemies to defeat them. It only needed to demonstrate that decency was not weakness, but discipline of a kind Germany had never mastered. The daily rhythm of the camp revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Morning roll call at 0700 hours, conducted without shouting. Work assignments distributed by a sergeant who consulted clipboards and addressed prisoners by rank. Afternoons dedicated to supervised labor or educational lectures. Evenings left open for reading, chess, or quiet conversation in the common room where a wireless played BBC broadcasts at low volume. Müller was assigned to the estate's vegetable garden, a sprawling plot behind the manor where turnips, carrots and cabbages grew in orderly rows. His partner was a British corporal named Davies, a young man from Yorkshire whose accent was so thick Müller could barely pass half his words. They worked in silence the first morning, pulling weeds from the frost-hardened soil while drizzle misted the air. Davies moved with the unhurried competence of someone raised on farmland, his hands calloused and quick. An hour passed before the corporal straightened, wiped his palms on his trousers, and offered Müller a cigarette from a battered tin. Müller hesitated, then accepted. They smoked together in the cold drizzle, standing between rows of turnips like scarecrows waiting for purpose. "You fought near Caen?" Davies asked, his voice flat, conversational. Müller nodded. "Thought so. Lost a mate there. Shrapnel took half his face." The words hung between them, neither accusation nor forgiveness, just fact. Davies stubbed out his cigarette against his boot heel and returned to weeding. Müller did the same, the gesture settling over him like wet cloth. No theatrics, no condemnation. Just two men acknowledging the violence that had brought them to this patch of English soil, then moving forward because the work required it. Inside the manor, routine solidified into ritual. The library became Müller's refuge. He borrowed a copy of Dickens in German translation and read late, into the night, the prose dense but strangely comforting. Other generals gravitated toward technical manuals, studying British engineering texts as if preparing for examinations they would never take. One former Luftwaffe commander sketched aircraft designs on scrap paper, his hands moving with muscle memory even though the war had grounded him permanently. The guards maintained discipline without cruelty. When a prisoner violated curfew, wandering the grounds after lights out, he was escorted back to his dormitory and issued a written warning. No beatings, no solitary confinement. The transparency of it unsettled Müller more than punishment would have. Rules were enforced because the system required order, not because authority demanded submission. Letters from home arrived weekly, each one a catalogue of devastation. Müller's wife wrote from Hamburg describing queues for potato rations that stretched for blocks. His brother, a civil engineer in Stuttgart, reported entire neighborhoods reduced to skeletal frameworks, families sheltering in basements with no roofs above them. The contrast was unbearable. Here, Müller ate tinned beef and slept under a heated roof. There, his countrymen scraped frost from windowsills to melt for drinking water. One evening, General Hartmann confronted him in the common room, his voice low but edged with bitterness. "They feed us better than our own people. Do you not see the insult in this?" Müller set down his book. Perhaps it is not an insult. Perhaps it is a lesson. In what? Their moral superiority? In function, Müller replied. They do not need to starve us to prove they have won. Hartmann's face darkened, but he said nothing more. The truth was too uncomfortable to argue against. The manor itself became a study in contradictions. Barbed wire coiled along the perimeter, yet the gardens were tended with care. Guard towers overlooked the grounds, yet prisoners walked freely during designated hours, unescorted. The British operated on a principle Müller struggled to articulate: authority restrained by rules it chose to obey. There was no Gestapo watching the guards, no party commissar enforcing loyalty. The system functioned because its operators believed in it, not because terror compelled them. One afternoon, after finishing work in the garden, Müller paused at the edge of the estate's small cemetery. A dozen headstones marked graves of manor staff who had died over centuries. Fresh flowers lay on one grave, placed there recently. Davies noticed him staring. "Gardener," the corporal said. "Died last month." Heart gave out. "You buried him here?" "Aye. Worked this land 40 years. Seemed right." Müller looked at the grave, the flowers, the care taken to honour a man whose only legacy was turnips and roses. He thought of the mass graves dug hastily across Europe, bodies catalogued by number instead of name. The difference was not one of resources but of values. Britain mourned its gardeners. Germany had discarded entire divisions. That night, sitting at the desk in his dormitory, Müller wrote in his journal, a habit he had resumed despite knowing the entries might be read. "I came here expecting punishment," he wrote in cramped script. "Instead, I have found a country that treats its enemies as it would wish to be treated. I do not yet understand the mechanism of this decency, but I am beginning to suspect it is the source of their victory." Outside, the rain continued. Inside, the radiator hissed its faint warmth. The war had ended, but the education had only begun. The excursion came without warning. 6 weeks into captivity, Müller and 4 other generals were informed they would accompany a British officer on a supervised visit to a nearby town. No explanation was offered beyond logistics. A lorry would depart at 0900 hours, return by 1600. Compliance was assumed, not requested. The drive took 40 minutes through countryside, still wearing winter's grey pallor. They passed villages with thatched roofs and Norman church spires, farmland divided by ancient hedgerows, and eventually entered a market town whose name Müller never learned. The lorry parked near a square dominated by a clock tower that had survived centuries but bore fresh scars. Shrapnel pockmarks across its stone face, windows bordered with plywood, a section of roof patched with corrugated tin. The British lieutenant, a soft-spoken man named Pierce, gestured toward the damage. "Luftwaffe raid, summer of 41, killed 17 civilians. Bakery took a direct hit." Müller followed his gaze. The bakery had been rebuilt, its facade mismatched brick, but smoke rose from its chimney and a hand-painted sign advertised fresh bread daily. Across the square, shops operated behind repaired windows. A queue stretched from a butcher's door, women in headscarves clutching ration books, chatting as they waited. Children played near a fountain, their laughter cutting through the cold air like bells. Pierce led them past the queue. No one glared. A few glanced curiously at the German uniforms, then returned to their conversations. One elderly woman nodded politely, as if they were merely visiting dignitaries rather than defeated enemies. The casualness of it stung worse than hostility. They walked to the town's edge where construction scaffolding surrounded a stone monument still in progress. Workers mixed mortar, while a stonemason carved names into granite panels. Pierce stopped before it, hands clasped behind his back. "War memorial," he said. 208 names. Sons, fathers, brothers. Town's population is 3,000. Müller counted the carved names visible so far, each letter chiseled with deliberate care. Beyond the monument, the queue for rationed bread continued. Mourning and rebuilding happened simultaneously, neither cancelling the other. He flashed to images of Germany. Monuments toppled, cities abandoned to rubble, memorials delayed. Because survival consumed all energy, here they honoured their dead while still hungry. Pierce turned to face the generals. "You asked once why we treat you as we do. I'll answer now. We could hate you. Many do. But hatred is exhausting, and we're already tired. So we choose law instead. Geneva Convention isn't charity. It's discipline. We follow it because abandoning principle in victory would mean losing what we fought to preserve." The words landed with surgical precision. Müller thought of the Major's correction weeks earlier. "You were our enemies. Now you are prisoners under our care." The distinction wasn't semantics. It was philosophy encoded into action. One of the other generals, a former artillery commander named Vogel, spoke in halting English. "You were bombed. Your people suffered. Yet you show us your towns, your memorials. Why?" Pierce's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in his eyes. "Because you need to see what resilience looks like without propaganda. You were told we'd collapse. We didn't. You were told democracy makes nations weak. It didn't. Perhaps seeing truth will prevent the next war." They returned to the lorry in silence. Müller sat in the back, watching the town recede through the canvas gap. The clock tower, the scaffolding, the bakery smoke, all of it ordinary, unremarkable, yet devastating in its implications. Germany had devoted architecture to power, monuments celebrating conquest, buildings designed to intimidate. Britain devoted it to continuity. A bombed bakery rebuilt. A memorial raised while rations were still scarce. The priorities revealed everything. Back at the manor, Müller retreated to the library. He sat at the writing desk near the window where fading daylight illuminated blank paper. For an hour, he stared at the page, trying to articulate what had shifted inside him. Finally, he began to write. Not for censors or posterity, but for clarity. "I came here expecting punishment and found accountability instead. The British do not humiliate us because they do not need to. Their victory is not theatrical, it is structural. They answer to each other, not just upward to authority. This creates a resilience we could not break because it does not depend on any single leader or ideology. It is woven into how they bury their gardeners, rebuild their bakeries, carve names into stone even while hungry. We built an empire on the principle that strength flows from domination. They built one on the principle that strength flows from consent. I am beginning to understand which foundation survives defeat." He folded the letter and placed it in his journal, knowing he would never send it. Outside, evening rain began again, tapping against the window like fingers drumming patience into glass. The war had taught him strategy and tactics. Captivity was teaching him something far more uncomfortable: the difference between power and authority, between submission and respect. Müller closed his eyes and listened to the rain. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, Britain continued its quiet work of rebuilding. Inside the wire, the architecture of his certainties crumbled, one realization at a time. Spring arrived tentatively, as if uncertain of its welcome. Bare branches sprouted pale green buds. The vegetable garden where Müller had spent months pulling weeds now yielded carrots and early lettuce. Davies, the Yorkshire corporal, showed him how to thin seedlings without damaging roots, his calloused hands working the soil with the same patient rhythm he'd maintained all winter. They spoke little, but the silence had evolved from suspicion into something resembling companionship. By April, repatriation lists began circulating. Names were called during morning roll, prisoners notified they would return to a Germany divided into occupation zones. Müller's name appeared in the third batch. Departure scheduled for May 12th. Destination, British Zone, Hamburg. He read the notice twice, feeling nothing resembling relief. The manor had become familiar in ways he hadn't anticipated. The library's worn leather chairs, the radiator's faint hiss, the view from the dormitory window overlooking the rose garden now blooming in reds and yellows. Barbed wire still coiled along the perimeter, but it had ceased to feel like confinement. Instead, it marked the boundary of a space where the rules made sense, where authority functioned without cruelty, where dignity was not negotiable. He spent his final week walking the estate grounds during permitted hours, cataloguing details he knew would fade. The pattern of lichen on the manor's north wall, the squeak of the garden gate's hinges, the way morning mist settled in the hollow beyond the oak trees. Each observation felt like evidence he needed to preserve against the amnesia of return. On his last evening, Davies found him in the garden examining the lettuce rows. The corporal carried 2 mugs of tea, handed one over without ceremony, and stood beside him in silence. Finally, Davies spoke. "You'll do all right back there." Müller cupped the warm mug. "Germany is not the country I left. Neither are you." The words settled between them. Müller glanced at the corporal, whose face remained impassive, focused on the garden, as if discussing seedlings rather than transformation. "You lost a friend at Caen," Müller said quietly. "I never apologized." Davies shook his head. "Wasn't yours to apologize for. War did that, not you specifically." He paused, sipped his tea. "You tend a garden well enough. That's something." They finished their tea as the sun dropped below the tree line, painting the sky in gradients of orange and grey. When Davies collected the empty mugs and walked back toward the manor, he raised one hand in a brief, informal salute. Müller returned it, the gesture feeling like a treaty signed in silence. The morning of departure arrived under clear skies. Müller and 23 other generals assembled in the manor's entrance hall, issued travel documents and ration parcels for the journey. The major who had briefed them months earlier stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. "You will be escorted to Southampton and transferred to a transport ship. Upon arrival in Hamburg, you will report to the demobilization center for processing. Your conduct here has been noted favorably in your records." No speeches, no moralizing, just information delivered with the same brisk efficiency that had characterized their entire captivity. The major nodded once, turned, and departed, his footsteps echoing across marble floors. The lorries rolled through countryside now fully green, hedgerows thick with hawthorn blossoms, fields scattered with grazing sheep. Müller pressed his palm against the canvas tarp and watched England pass for the last time. At Southampton, the harbour churned with activity. Cranes swinging cargo, stevedores shouting coordinates, ships moored in rows like patient elephants. The transport vessel assigned to repatriation was a converted freighter, its hull streaked with rust but seaworthy. As Müller climbed the gangway, a church bell tolled in the distance, marking noon. The sound carried across the water, clear and untroubled, blending with the industrial clatter of reconstruction. He paused at the rail, looking back at the port city. Bombed buildings stood beside intact ones, scaffolding everywhere, crews repairing what could be saved. Civilization's rhythm continuing, indifferent to ideology or defeat. The ship's engines thudded to life beneath the deck, a slow heartbeat gaining strength. Muller remained at the rail as England receded, the coastline diminishing into haze. He thought of the Major's correction, the gardener's grave, the bakery rebuilt with mismatched brick, Davies handing him tea without ceremony. Each memory a fragment of the education he hadn't known he needed. Germany awaited him. Rubble, rationing, occupation, an uncertain future built atop catastrophic failure. Yet standing at the rail, listening to the ship's engines and the distant echo of that church bell, Muller felt something unexpected. Not hope exactly, but clarity. He had seen a system that functioned without terror, authority restrained by principles it chose to honor. The distinction mattered. It had always mattered. As the English coast faded entirely, he understood that captivity had not been punishment, but reckoning. The barbed wire had held him long enough to witness what his ideology had blinded him to. That power serving creation rather than domination was a victory propaganda could never explain. The ship turned east toward a divided homeland. Behind him, the church bell faded into distance, but its rhythm remained, steady and unshaken, the sound of tomorrow already in motion.